It's April 15th, 1912. We're in the North Atlantic, and the people on the RMS Titanic are running out of time. As water gushes into passengers' cabins, people try to find their way out, only to be lost in a maze of tight corridors and soaking wet carpet. This was supposed to be a luxury vessel, one of the largest and finest the world had ever seen. People would do whatever they could to snag a ticket for the maiden voyage, trying to find a better life for themselves in America. But as they wade through knee-deep water, that feels like a world away. They must have known that they were going to die. The only question remaining is how painful it would be. In the middle of the second largest ocean on the planet, with no rescue for dozens of miles, the Titanic sank, taking hundreds upon hundreds of people with her to the bottom of the ocean. But how did these people actually die? We've all seen the movie and assume people clung on to doors before fading below the surface peacefully, but I'm here to tell you that it was much, much worse. Almost every person who died that night in April of 1912 suffered a lot before they eventually, mercifully, passed. And the worst part is that not a single person had to lose their life, let alone in such a painful and isolated setting. So, let's review one of the most notorious accidents in history from the accounts of those who were really there to find out what really happened. Along the way, you might learn some things about the Titanic that you never knew before. So, remember your life jacket. This video is going to get chilly. So, before we get into why and exactly how people suffered and died on the Titanic, we need to go back to 1911, the year before the ship's doomed maiden voyage. During this time, the finishing touches were being made on the largest passenger cruise liner the world had ever seen up to that point. The company that was building her was now the infamous company White Star Line, and it was being built in the Northern Irish capital of Belfast. Fun fact, you can still go to see where the shipyard for the Titanic was to this very day in Belfast, and there's even a museum there to commemorate the vessel. But that's the present. Back in the past, the Titanic wasn't the only ship White Star Line was building. The Olympic, which had been launched in 1910 to much fanfare, and then the Britannic, which would launch in 1914. Both ships were considered part of the so-called Olympic class of White Star Line vessels, which were all similarly sized, but Titanic was to be the largest ever seen at the time when she would travel across the Atlantic to the New World. Cruise ship travel had started to become more and more popular, allowing companies like White Star Line to invest in larger and larger vessels that could travel both further and in greater luxury. And wow, could the Titanic offer luxury. For those willing to pay top dollar for first-class tickets, you couldn't find opulence on the water like it anywhere else in the world. In some ways, it outdid the major hotels in major cities. On the top decks, there were beautiful cabins with comfortable four-poster beds. There were fanciful cafes, restaurants, and bars for all your finest culinary needs. There was even a gym, a swimming pool, and beautiful chandeliers. Guests would be adorned with the best levels of service and entertainment whilst they voyaged across the high seas. For those who were well off, it promised unparalleled decadence. For those with lesser means, it still afforded the options of second and third class for the journey. Over 2,200 people set sail from Southampton on April the 10th, 1912, made up of roughly 900 crew and 1,300 passengers. They were headed for New York City. Some wanted to go and see the New World, whilst others were migrating there permanently from the old one. Sadly, though, they'd never make it, because even before it set sail, there were issues with the Titanic. Whilst White Star Line were the ones funding the ship being built and its voyage, it was Harland and Wolff shipyards that was actually doing the building. Now, shipyards aren't the safest of workplaces, and in the very early 20th century, this is an understatement. 8 workers died just before the Titanic even touched the water. There were also not enough lifeboats, as many of you may already know. There were 20, which could accommodate roughly half the passengers on the vessel at full capacity. That was actually more than was standard at the time, but we'll soon see the catastrophic ramifications of such a choice all the same. Beyond health and safety, though, many people might know of the fractious relationship between the heads of White Star Line and Harland and Wolff. Thomas Andrews, the managing director of Harland and Wolff, was concerned about the ship's survivability on the water. He spoke of a meeting he had with Joseph Bruce Ismay, his counterpart at White Star Line, where he said that, "To see the little red marks all over the blueprints, first thing I thought was, now here's a man who wants me to build him a ship that's gonna be sunk. We're sending gilded eggshells out to the sea." That's a far cry from White Star Line's official stance that the Titanic was unsinkable. Vice President of White Star Line, Philip Franklin, even said as such on the very night the Titanic had sunk during a press conference where he stated, "There is no danger that Titanic will sink. The boat is unsinkable, and nothing but inconvenience will be suffered by the passengers." As you'll see, we'll get into those inconveniences later. But he wasn't the only one talking this way. Edward Smith, the captain of the Titanic, said the same when he commented, "I cannot imagine any condition which would cause a ship to founder. I cannot conceive of any vital disaster happening to this vessel. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." Although another statement of the captain's would turn out to be eerily prophetic of what actually happened to the infamous vessel. He stated that, "We do not care anything for the heaviest storms in these big ships. It is fog that we fear. The big icebergs that drift into warmer water melt much more rapidly underwater than on the surface, and sometimes a sharp, low reef extending 200 or 300 feet beneath the sea is formed. If a vessel should run on one of these reefs, half her bottom might be torn away." And of course, almost exactly that would happen on her maiden voyage when she struck part of an iceberg hidden below the water. As water poured into the ship faster than anyone could comprehend, and the events that followed, I wonder if Captain Smith thought about the things he'd said. It just goes to show, declare any ship unsinkable, and Mother Nature will go out of her way to punish your hubris. But the question does remain, when it did sink days into its voyage across the Atlantic to New York City, what actually happened to the people who never made it onto the lifeboats? The Leonardo DiCaprios of the world, stranded in the middle of the second largest ocean on Earth. Well, it was not pretty. When the Titanic started to sink, many of the passengers simply refused to believe it at first. The relatively lax safety standards at the time meant that even in large emergencies, people took their sweet time getting to the lifeboats, convinced that there really was nothing to worry about. After all, what was the rush? They were told she was unsinkable, after all. Because of this, some preferred to stay on the large, lit, stable ship where it felt safer than on a small lifeboat getting tossed around in the North Atlantic. But this would turn out to be a fatal mistake for many, as the more organised disembarking slowly turned over time into a chaotic nightmare. The limited number of lifeboats were launched as per protocol, but many were hugely underfilled. As just one example, there was one lifeboat carrying 12 people in a boat made to hold 40. Dozens, possibly hundreds, of empty spaces were left as a result, condemning far more people to die than ever had to. Although, on the other hand, people were injuring themselves and others merely by attempting to get into the lifeboats, especially as the passengers' panic grew. The crush would knock people unconscious and crack ribs as people jumped on top of each other to try and reach safety. But almost nobody would have died this way. Sure, people would have been worse for wear, and their best evening wear might have been ruined, but they would live. Not everyone was so lucky, especially those below decks. As we mentioned, the Titanic had 3 classes of accommodation that its passengers would use during its planned voyage to the Big Apple. First, second, and third, sometimes known as steerage. First class was up near the top deck of the ship with all the luxury you could want in its accommodations. It being closer to the surface deck meant that those with more expensive tickets could reach the lifeboats quicker. Those in second class were placed in a lot of different areas, so for them it was luck of the draw, but if their accommodations were on a lower deck, then their chances of survival when the icy sea water burst inside were inadvertently lowered with it. And then there was steerage, down in the bows of the ship. Near the bow is where third-class passengers stayed in a stark contrast to the more fashionable cabins and chandeliers upstairs. This by itself made it more difficult to escape the maze of corridors on the massive vessel. Those who then did try and escape were met with a convoluted route to get back to the topside. The Titanic was famously hard to navigate and took people days to get their heads around its enormous layout, meaning people easily got lost and hit dead ends, especially in an emergency. There were also no public alarms of the ship's sinking. After all, why would you bother to install such an alarm if the ship is unsinkable? But stewards did make their way down to these quarters in the depths of third class to warn the passengers door to door. Indeed, one survivor remembered crewmen rushing through the corridors shouting, "All up on deck unless you want to get drowned." They reportedly also told people to put on life jackets. But remember when we said the Titanic was filled with those emigrating to the United States? Well, many of those poorer immigrants down in the lower decks didn't speak particularly good English, so when warnings came, they either didn't understand what they were being told or didn't grasp the full scale of the issue until it was too late. As it was night time when the ship hit the iceberg, many of the third-class compartments already had their passengers soundly asleep inside. Mere minutes after impact, dozens of people would wake up to find water already at their feet, and from there, it was a mad scramble to get topside with your family and belongings, all whilst racing the rising deluge in the corridors. Carl Janssen, one of the relatively small number of third-class survivors, later recalled, "Then I ran down to my cabin to bring my other clothes, watch and bag, but only had time to take the watch and coat when water with enormous force came into the cabin, and I had to rush up to the deck again, where I found my friends standing with lifebelts on and with terror painted on their faces. What should I do now, with no lifebelt and no shoes and no cap?" As a result, there was total chaos as a torrent swept through hallways at frightening speeds, tossing people around into furniture and tossing furniture around into people in return. Water pressure could have easily trapped many inside their compartments within a short space of time. Others would have exhausted themselves fighting the torrent. Either way, the result for many in the lowest decks was the same: drowning. Some would have mercifully been unconscious, others would have felt the water burn their lungs as they asphyxiated deep below. People on slightly higher decks may not have escaped this kind of fate either, but they still had a better chance than those down in steerage. One second-class survivor, Mary Davis Wilburn, who managed to get a spot on lifeboat 13, was quoted as saying, "The dead came up holding children in their arms. The poor people never had a chance." But it wasn't just the passengers below decks who were fighting for their lives. There was also a number of crewmen looking to help in any way they could to keep the vessel functioning. Just 15 minutes after the initial collision, the mail room on G-Deck was totally submerged. RMS actually stands for Royal Mail Ship, with commercial vessels like the Titanic officially licensed by the British Royal Mail Service to carry post across the sea. So there were a number of staff on board whose job it was to sort it all out. The 5 postal clerks working down there heroically struggled to haul massive bags of mail out from the rapidly flooding decks. They still had a duty in the toughest of circumstances, and all 5 would sadly lose their lives trying to uphold that duty, just some of the many swept up in those cold corridors. Meanwhile, in the boiler rooms, engineers and stokers were frantically trying to keep the lights on and the water out. If the boiler rooms flooded, the Titanic would truly be dead in the water, and many more would die from being stuck below decks whilst wading through the rising tide in pitch-black darkness. The engineers even desperately opened some of the watertight doors just to get extra water pumps online. In the end, all 35 of the engineers on board would make the ultimate sacrifice whilst trying to keep her afloat. By roughly 1:30 a.m, the battle to save the Titanic was effectively lost. Her bow dipped deep below the water, tilting the decks and causing people to fall or jump into the sea. The final lifeboat was lowered at around 2 a.m, but there were still another 1,500 people on board, simply left to their icy fates with no escape other than into the frigid North Atlantic. People clung to railings and rushed to the rising stern, but it was no use. In the ship's final minutes, the lights would finally give out, plunging those left on the ship into total oblivion. By 2:20 a.m, there was an almighty crunch as the Titanic was violently ripped in half by the ocean under its own weight. Soon afterwards, she would slip below the water completely. Those who had drowned below decks would likely stay there for good. And this brings us to our next way that people likely died on the Titanic. Blunt force trauma. At least, indirectly. You see, the higher a height that something falls into water from, the harder the impact. At around 40 metres, or 120 feet, falling into water feels like falling onto concrete and can be fatal. The highest point people jumped from the deck of the Titanic was reportedly around 20 metres or 60 feet. Not enough to be lethal, but certainly enough to cause injury or even knock someone unconscious, which would make one's chance of survival in the water even worse. If there was anyone still alive inside the ship when it was torn in half, those in the bulkhead probably would have been crushed to death by the mass of the vessel itself, with some being thrown long distances into the water. Others likely would have been struck by a menagerie of falling debris from the ship as it ripped in half. Suitcases, boilers, machinery, railings, pipes, pianos, chandeliers, and all other cargo would likely have been fatal depending on where they fell. Even the slightest injury or blood loss would have caused death indirectly, as those left treading water waited hours for help. Of all the parts of the infamous James Cameron film, one part that was genuinely true during the ship's sinking was that the band stoically continued to play until the end whilst the ship went down, perhaps out of an attempt to calm other passengers, perhaps as just a coping mechanism when facing their own imminent deaths. Either way, it was an extraordinary act of bravery. One of the survivors, a man by the name of Lawrence Beasley, commented on this, stating, quote, "Many brave things were done that night, but none more brave than by those few men playing minute after minute as the ship settled quietly lower and lower in the sea." As the water slowly consumed what was left of the Titanic, there was a reported sucking motion from the water that would have drawn more people under the waves with a terrific force. Now, this was not inescapable, depending on how far away one was from the ship, as we have some reports from survivors who managed to outswim the water's pull. If you were far enough away, you probably wouldn't have felt it at all, but it's likely the weaker swimmers, or those too close to the ship when it went under, who were pulled down with it. It's even possible that some people survived in small air pockets within the ship itself, but we haven't found any evidence of this, and there were certainly no survivors who claimed to have experienced it. If someone was stuck in a compartment as the ship sank, it likely wouldn't have been very long before the water rushed in. It would have been a harrowing death, but at least it was a quick fate, rather than facing days in the dark all alone underwater with nothing but your thoughts. So, those not fortunate enough to get a seat on an underfilled lifeboat would have to face the icy water with little more than an early 20th century life jacket to keep them floating. Many others didn't even get that, left with nothing other than their heavy dress clothes to shield them from the cold. But that also sapped energy whilst they treaded water. Some could only keep this up for so long, quickly exhausting themselves, resulting in them drowning soon after. Eva Hart, who was just 7 years old when she escaped the Titanic, remembered what it was like to have people slowly suffocate all around you in the water, stating that, "The sounds of people drowning are something that I cannot describe to you, and neither can anyone else. It's the most dreadful sound, and there is a terrible silence that follows it." And for those who were in the water, drowning was merely the end of the road. Getting there was likely due to hypothermia. Remember, we are in the North Atlantic. The closest point to where the Titanic sank was Nova Scotia in Canada. It wasn't exactly Caribbean. The water and the night air were both extremely cold. Water estimated to be around -2 degrees Celsius or around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Not many people can survive in water that cold for that long, and so for most who ended up in the water, they went numb, then tired, then strangely warm before sinking below the surface. Several flares had been fired into the air already by the crew, and people on other ships did apparently see them, but it would be hours before any help actually arrived, just due to the sheer distance of the nearest ship that was able to respond. For those in the water, it was essentially a death sentence, the perfect recipe for contracting hypothermia, and after that, nobody lasts long. But for many, it wouldn't even take hours to die. Falling into cold water can send a person into shock. This can lead to heart failure within minutes, which would have taken many below the waves who were still clinging to some chance of survival from the water. Thankfully, though, this also would have been somewhat quick and somewhat less painful than drowning. Charles Lightoller, a second officer aboard the Titanic and a rare survivor who was at one point in the water, stated that striking the water was like 1,000 knives being driven into one's body. The freezing sensation, the potential shock, and the pain would lead to some having an automatic bodily reaction to hyperventilate, as is common in cold water. This led to many drowning, whilst others inhaled water out of sheer panic. And it's easy to see why. They were flailing around in the dark, with no help on the horizon, in freezing cold water. Most would feel nothing but utter terror in such a scenario. Because of every deadly way that a person could die during the sinking of the Titanic, it was very difficult for anyone in the water to escape falling foul of one of them. The odds were simply stacked against many from the very start, and especially if you didn't make it to a lifeboat in time, your odds of survival were slim at best. Only a handful of people in the water were alive when help finally came, and even that was a miracle for those few. The RMS Carpathia, a passenger steamship, had travelled through difficult terrain at maximum speed upon hearing the Titanic's distress signal. When she finally arrived on site, she helped drag over 700 survivors from the various lifeboats over the course of many hours. But you might be asking, if there was space on the lifeboats, why didn't the survivors use them to go back to the ship and rescue those from the water after it sank? Well, heartbreakingly, most lifeboats did not row back to save people immediately. Those inside the boats feared that panicked swimmers outside the boats would try to scramble inside and rapidly capsize them. They may well have been right. These were small, unstable wooden lifeboats out on the open ocean, and one flipping over would have meant certain death for everyone inside. Regardless, people had to make the choice not to save others, which left many to their fates. Some were incredulous at this after the fact, but whilst it might not have been the choice you or I would have made, until you're in that life or death situation, you don't know what you might choose to do to live. Eventually, the wailing from the water was reported to have largely stopped after around 40 minutes. The silence, punctured by a handful of groans and cries in the night, would have been very distressing indeed. And just like that, people had been frozen, drowned, bludgeoned, injured, knocked unconscious, sent into shock, and torn apart over a matter of hours. But how many people died because of the many cascading mistakes made both before launch and on the day of the sinking? Well, a hell of a lot. Now, the numbers aren't exact, but most estimates place the total amount of dead at 1,500. That's roughly 68% of the people on board in terms of passengers and crew. But had the lifeboats been filled to capacity, that would have fallen to under half, around 47%. That's still not great in all reality, but it would have saved hundreds of people who were instead damned to the depths forever. There was an interesting class distinction as well in terms of number of dead. As we stated, those on the upper decks were closer to the lifeboats, and so more of them were saved. And the numbers are pretty revealing. 39% of first-class passengers perished after the Titanic sank. In the second class, that number rose to 58%, and in third class, a monumental 76% of people lose their lives, almost double the rate of those from first class. 80% of male passengers lost their lives. That's what happens when you prioritise the women and children first. Almost exclusively men were left behind. Those who survived either faced braving the water or were elderly enough to be considered a lifeboat priority. The youngest person to die on the Titanic was Sidney Leslie Goodwin, who was just 19 months old. Of the 109 children on board the Titanic, 53, around half, would not come home again. Meanwhile, 76% of the crew perished too. This included the engineers and the postal clerks we mentioned earlier, but also Captain Smith himself, who was seen going down with the ship and succumbed to one of the many horrible fates we've talked about today. Many more workers would lose their lives doing what they could to help passengers get off the ship in time. 333 bodies would be recovered from the sea, but given that's roughly only 1/5 of those who died, many more were destined for a watery grave. And they're still there to this day, even since the ship's wreckage had been discovered in 1985. Ultimately, the story of the Titanic is one of great hubris, of laughing in the face of Mother Nature, only to have her spit back. It was born of a time where man believed he could conquer nature, but freak events like the sinking of the Titanic proved anything but, as hundreds shivered and died below the water's surface. It was a menagerie of errors from back to front that ultimately led to the unnecessary and horrifying deaths of 1,500 people. You can't help but think, what if, when it comes to the Titanic? What if it never struck the iceberg? What if there were an appropriate number of lifeboats for everyone? One could argue that ultimately, the Titanic's sinking led to greater safety standards on ocean liners the world over, eventually evolving as part of the strict regulations that waterborne vessels must adhere to today. But that is cold comfort to those who had to live through one of the most shocking events in maritime history.